It's, of course, the first time that Putin has come to India in 4 years. It's the first time since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is that it comes at a what I would describe as a precarious moment in the sense that India is under significant levels of pressure from the West, particularly the U.S. Prime Minister Modi sent a very strong signal to some key audiences in the West, including in Washington. The joint statement that came out of the summit was indeed quite expansive, which is not a surprise. It highlighted all types of areas of cooperation, from military cooperation to indeed energy. Bottom line, the way I see it, you know, India, I don't think India certainly welcomed this message, but I don't think it was surprised from it. Whereas in the US and the West, also no surprise. I think that it would certainly intensify the unhappiness that you have in the West, just how much Russia and India have been willing to work together when it comes to energy cooperation. For President Trump, at a moment when he badly wants Putin to buy into this peace process, Prime Minister Modi is delivering the very message that President Trump would want delivered. Prime Minister Modi taking advantage of Putin being in India to try to bolster the relationship and try to identify new ways to work more with Russia.
I just want to start straight by asking you that President Putin has concluded a successful visit to India where he received a warm welcome, and two countries have signed various agreements, uh, including on health and maritime cooperation. A strategic economic roadmap was also signed. What is your first reaction to it? How do you view this visit?
It was a successful visit, and I would argue that it was one of the most important summits between the two leaders in quite some time for two main reasons. One, it's of course the first time that Putin has come to India in 4 years. It's the first time since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the fact that it had been so long meant that it was very important to have a successful summit so that the two leaders could reassert the importance and strength of this very special relationship. The second reason why it was such an important visit is that it comes at a what I would describe as a precarious moment in the sense that India is under significant levels of pressure from the West, particularly the U.S., to reduce its energy imports from Russia, and indeed it has reduced some of those imports in recent weeks. So I think that it was important for these two leaders to show that even in the face of a lot of pressure from the West, this is a relationship that will endure. And that's why I think it's very important that Prime Minister Modi sent a very strong signal to some key audiences in the West, including in Washington, when he went to the airport himself to meet President Putin. This sort of is outside of protocol. It's not a typical thing to be done, but the fact that he did that, I think, was a very strong gesture that showed his own personal. It reflected his personal views of President Putin. And it also, I think, reflected just how strong the relationship is between India and Russia.
Michael, I just want to draw your attention to the outcome of this particular visit. 16 pacts was signed, an economic roadmap for 2030, labor mobility pact. It seems that energy has become a new linchpin for ties between India and Russia. What do you make of these agreement? Does this indicate a shift in ties between India and Russia?
Well, I mean, the joint statement that came out of the summit was indeed quite expansive, which is not a surprise. It highlighted all types of areas of cooperation, from military cooperation to indeed energy, to many other aspects of commercial collaborations, as well as infrastructure, cultural cooperation. There was a lot there, which is what one would expect. On the energy side, yes. I mean, the joint statement described energy as a significant pillar of the relationship. But I would argue that this is where one of the biggest challenges lies in the relationship, just because, we've seen that because of new Western sanctions on Russia and because of India's desire to get a trade deal with the U.S., it has been willing to cut back, at least temporarily, its energy imports from Russia. And that, I think, at least in the immediate term, will affect the energy relationship. That might be why you had particularly strong language from President Putin on the energy front, in which he essentially ensured uninterrupted supply of fuel to India, which I think was really meant to be a defiant message to the West. I do think that energy will continue to be a big part of the relationship, but I think it's also important that the two countries look for other aspects of commercial ties to focus on. And I think we've seen that a lot of discussion in the summit about agriculture, about pharmaceuticals, about a lot. So, I think that it might be time to look at how to refashion the relationship in a way that the commercial relationship can grow even beyond the energy cooperation, which I think has long defined the non-security aspects of cooperation between India and Russia. You're muted.
Michael, though you have mentioned about the statement by President Putin on energy front, I just also want to highlight. I just want to ask a particular question about this. Uh, the statement was that Russia is ready to continue uninterrupted shipments of oil. This statement is coming in the backdrop of Western pressure on India to stop buying Russian oil. Was this a message to the just to the West or to India also that we are ready? You just tell us we are ready to supply oil, and if this was a message to West, how are we expecting them to take? Or how is US expected to react from out of this?
I mean, I think that Putin's message uh, was meant for both audiences, the Western audience as well as India. But I don't think it's a surprising message, and I don't think either the Indian or the U.S. or Western side would be surprised. I mean, this is essentially President Putin reiterating a longstanding policy, right? And that's that Russia has been willing to provide cheap oil, cheap energy to India for quite some time. It is significant in the sense that it comes at a moment when I would argue that India is facing perhaps unprecedented levels of pressure from the West to scale back, and the fact that you have new sanctions on several key Russian energy firms that went into effect just a few weeks ago, that means it's a bit of a new ball game, so to speak, and that India really has to be very careful about how it engages with Russia on energy cooperation, at least for the immediate term. Keeping in mind here that this is all because of the war in Ukraine, right? I mean, if there were not a war in Ukraine, if President Putin were to agree to the peace process that President Trump badly wants him to buy into, then we would not be talking about all this pressure coming from the West, certainly not from Trump, who I would argue actually has a fairly moderate view of Russia. He's professed his admiration for Putin in the past. So this is something that will be a challenge for India only so long as the war continues. Unfortunately, the war could continue for some time. But bottom line, the way I see it, you know, India, I don't think India certainly welcomed this message, but I don't think it was surprised from it. Whereas in the U.S. and the West, also no surprise. I think that it would certainly intensify the unhappiness that you have in the West about just how much Russia and India have been willing to work together when it comes to energy cooperations.
Michael, you mentioned about the Ukraine war. I just want to draw your attention to what PM Modi said during the meetings. He said India is not neutral and it is on the side of peace. Well, time and again, we have been accused of being a fence sitter. How do you take this message by PM Modi, and how do you take it?
Prime Minister Modi and President Trump essentially think the same way when it comes to the war. They both want it to end. I mean, that's the simple position. And I would argue, I've argued before, that Prime Minister Modi has gone further than any other non-Western leader in expressing his opposition to the war and calling for it, including publicly, including while sitting right next to Putin, calling for the war to end. And this is a message that he surely reiterated. This is not an era of war. I'm sure he reiterated this at the summit. And I think that I've been asked a lot, how does Washington look at this summit? Maybe you're going to ask me that question later. I think that one way that Washington could look at this summit is that it's actually very helpful for President Trump at a moment when he badly wants Putin to buy into this peace process. Prime Minister Modi is delivering the very message that President Trump would want delivered, in the sense that we don't support war. This is not an era of war. But I think that unfortunately, another way that Washington could look at this summit is that, well, this is a case of Prime Minister Modi taking advantage of Putin being in India to try to bolster the relationship and try to identify new ways to work more with Russia. The latter is probably the way that the visit was perceived in Washington. But no, I think that it's very important that these comments by the Prime Minister were made. And I suspect that this might have been one of the few awkward moments during what was probably otherwise a very warm, supportive conversation. And Putin knows Modi's view on the war. I'm sure he knew that Modi was going to bring it up. But I think it's very important that the Prime Minister brought this up, just to amplify particularly in the face of skeptics in the West, that India does not support this war. It's not trying to bankroll the war with oil imports from Russia. It's importing oil because it's something it's cheap, and this is something that the U.S. has previously encouraged before the Trump administration was in power. So it's a complex issue for sure, but I think that it's good and it's very important that the prime minister made this comment. And we all can agree that this war needs to end. It's a terrible war. It never should have started. And I think it's important that Prime Minister Modi was sending that message to Putin.
Michael, I just want to highlight one point as well, that experts here in Delhi and as well as in some in US believe that US tariff, which was supposed to deter India from buying Russian oil, uh, have nudged the two countries closer to each other. Do you also believe that? And what is the future of the ties between India and Russia?
I would argue that it is a bit of a challenging moment for the India-Russia relationship. I mean, mainly because of all the pressure coming from the West and the fact that India has now, at least for now, um, reduced its energy imports from Russia, which is going to affect one of the pillars of the partnership. And I think that one could also look at the security aspects of cooperation, where we've seen some delays in getting Russian military equipment to India. And I think that the war in Ukraine makes things even more complicated because I think that one cannot ensure that these weapon shipments will make it to India on in Ukraine with its war there. And energy and arms have really been two of the key aspects of cooperation between the two. I think that this is a relationship that will endure. It has to endure. There's no question it's going to endure, but it might need to identify some new areas of focus. It might need to reassess how current aspects of cooperation are carried out. I think that one could talk about looking for different areas of commercial cooperation to focus on, and I think that India certainly wants to look at ways to increase exports to Russia to achieve a better trade balance with Russia. There was a lot of discussion at the summit about agriculture, about pharmaceuticals, and other things. That's important. I think that the cultural cooperation aspect of this relationship is critical. Both publics have a lot of love for the other side. So I think that would be good. The joint statement did emphasize cultural cooperation. So cultural connects are important to look at. And I think, this is a relationship that could also benefit from the two countries partnering in certain geographies. The joint statement talked about Arctic cooperation, which is great. But one thing that I've argued is that Central Asia could be a place where these two countries can look to work more closely together. India has been trying to increase its access to Central Asia. It's been trying to build up ties with Central Asia. For geographic reasons, it's not that easy to do. I think Russia can be helpful because of its own influence in that region. And of course, China has its own influence in Central Asia. Pakistan has been trying to increase its own access to Central Asia. So I think that India working with Russia, its good friend Russia, could perhaps help advance India's goals in that region. So that's one other thing that I would highlight.
Michael, I just want to, you just
Mhm.
mentioned about how is it being viewed in US and might be viewed in US. I just want to ask you what is expected from them now, because earlier we saw West was very uncomfortable with this visit. How are they going to react now, and what does it say about the relationship between West and India, particularly US, if we talk about US and India?
So, I'm in New Delhi now. I've been here the last few days, and I've seen, firsthand just how special this relationship is between India and Russia, and also the personal relationship between the two leaders. And there have been signs all over the city with Putin's likeness welcoming him, and so on. And I think that some in the West have sought to promote the isolation of Russia. It was never a goal that was going to work. Russia is much too powerful a global player for that to happen. And we've seen, in recent years, Russia was able to convene a large number of countries to come to Russia for a BRIC summit. Russia has friends. It has quite a few friends in the global South, in the Middle East, of course, in India. And, I think that if nothing else, this summit was the latest reminder to the West that Russia cannot be isolated, and it can count. Two of the most critical global players are close to Russia, India, and of course to the consternation of India. China has also become increasingly close to Russia since the war in Ukraine. But I think that, after the summit, it'll all come back to what I said before, that the West could look at this summit as something that could be seen as a way to move the needle forward with the peace process. If Modi was able to deliver an important message to Putin about needing to end the war. But at the same time, if the West goes in the other direction and looks at this as another case of India trying to strengthen Russia and to try to bolster Russia by offering more support and cooperation, that's not going to work out very well in terms of how the West perceives what India is doing. But at the end of the day, this is not going to change India's close partnerships with countries in the West. I don't think that's going to be the case at all. And one of the big priorities, of course, moving forward for India's foreign policy is to get a trade deal with the EU. And of course, the Europeans have been very critical of Putin and his war in Ukraine, and are unhappy with India's relationship with Russia. But the Europeans want to work with India. That's very clear. And even in the U.S., for all we can talk about the tensions in U.S.-India relations, we've discussed these before. I think that in Washington there is a desire to continue to work with India, despite everything that's going on, and despite this visit by Putin.
You mentioned that there is a desire in Washington to work with India. We are negotiating a trade deal with the US. And do you think the current visit will have any impact, or the things are going the way they are going right now?
Yeah, I mean, we've been hearing for so long that the two sides are close to a deal, but there has not been an announcement of a deal, which could be seen as a good thing, that they must be really close, or that it might be a bad thing. And why hasn't there been a deal if they've been saying it's close for so long? I don't think this visit will impact the trade talks, and I would argue that India has already done something very significant to get it closer to the finish line on the trade talks, in that it has reduced its Russian oil imports, and it's signed a recent gas deal with the U.S. I think that'll really help move the needle forward. I think it's going to come down to other issues that are unrelated to Russia. These issues we've been hearing about for some time. Will India open up some of its more politically sensitive sectors to U.S. access, like agriculture? Tariffs, that's still something that's going to be under discussion. So I think that getting to the finish line on a deal will depend on factors and concessions that don't have much to do with Russia, because on the Russia front, I think India has done what it has to do. So it's just a matter of getting other issues done.